how to talk for dummies, or really how to hold conversations if you're an introvert. Now, I'm a pretty average person with average life experiences, but something I do take pride in is my acquired ability to talk to people, which isn't something I always had. I did grow up a pretty shy kid, and I've struggled with self-esteem, so there have been times in my life where just the basic and mundane act of talking to people has been very difficult for me. But presently speaking, I'd like to think that I can handle those types of social situations pretty well now, and in fact excel in them because of the opportunities and practice I've had thus far. And so I'd like to share a little bit more in detail what I learned from my experience and summarize it through 5 basic strategies that you can implement if you are someone who's introverted or struggling with social awkwardness, and hopefully it will be helpful. And all of this is on my mind because this past weekend, I was invited to a kickball tournament party for someone's birthday through a friend of a friend. So I went there only knowing 2 people in a group of 20 people, meaning the rest were virtually strangers. And I wanted to have a good time, so I knew that I needed to put in the effort. So what does it actually take to thrive in this situation? Let's start with tip number 1, which is about breaking the ice. Now, I think when you are meeting new people, there's 3 very basic pieces of information that you need to acquire and get out of the way before you can start having conversations, generally speaking. And these 3 things are very, very simple. The name of the person, their occupation, and why you are there in the same place at the same time meeting. At this kickball tournament where I basically knew no one, I actually got there early to the park, and so I had to wait for other people to start showing up and forming a group because I didn't know who I was looking for. But once I saw a group of girls forming near the baseball diamond, it clicked for me that those are the people that I'm hanging out with today. So I walked over there and introduced myself, and then I asked everyone else for their names. And then I asked, oh, how do you all know Helena? Did you go to school together? And from that point, I could start to learn if people were in school or working or doing nothing like me. And I knew we were all there for Helena's party, so that was all 3 bases covered. And after I had all that information, it was a lot easier for me to start thinking of things I can ask people about and to start conversations with. Which brings me to tip number 2. Get them to talk as much as possible. You don't feel like talking all that much? That's actually okay. But then you have to be prepared to be the person doing the listening. And to set that up, you also need to ask the right questions. An important distinction I'd like to make right now is between a closed-ended and open-ended conversation. Please don't quote me on this definition because I did not Google it to verify. But the difference between a closed-ended and open-ended question makes huge difference when you're talking to people. I could ask someone, oh, are you watching the TV show The Pit? And they could answer yes or no. And that's pretty much all they can answer with, unless they feel like going further. Or I could ask them, oh, what do you think of the TV show The Pit? And then they have to explain themselves. Really, that slight difference in word has a really big impact because instead of answering a question with a yes or no or something of a correct answer, you're getting that other person to explain why for something. And why is always a lot more long-winded and unique compared to yes or no. One way of thinking of this entire thing is a very polite interrogation. So you suddenly want to know everything about that person and what they think on this subject. You're going to ask, tell me why you like this character. Tell me why you don't like the hospital TV shows. Tell me what you're watching instead. Tell me everything. That's basically what you're gunning for. Getting other people to talk about themselves and in a way carry the conversation is a pretty harmless way of making that conversation work without actually having to do a lot of work yourself. You can take any of those sort of subjects that you suspect the other person might have an interest in and work from there. And I will say this can require a little bit of reading the other person and analyzing them, but it doesn't have to be complicated. In this case, you can judge the book by its cover and see where that takes you. And as long as you don't ask anything from a place of assumption or prejudice, but rather just curiosity, this should go okay. But of course, even in conversations where the other person is doing a lot of talking, you still want to be able to respond with your own thoughts and opinions wherever insertable. Because one of the easiest ways to kill a conversation is to let the other person share their thoughts and opinions and not to have a specific response besides, yeah, I get it, I see. Which brings me to tip number 3. Neutrality is forgettable. You have to be willing to share some of your thoughts and opinions that reflect you as a person, even a little bit, if you want to be remembered at all. I think a hurdle in social posturing that introverts can have is that idea of sticking to saying things that are very polite and neutral because you don't want to say anything that might be perceived in a negative way. The real downside of this is, in a way, you're not really being yourself. And when you do try to be neutral like this, you still can survive the social situation, but you're not necessarily thriving, and you're definitely not going to leave a strong impression. For example, while I was at the kickball tournament, someone complimented the bag I brought that day, and I said, "Thank you, it's from Japan." And then I thought to myself, they probably like it because it's Studio Ghibli and it's Spirited Away. So I asked them, "Oh, do you like your Studio Ghibli movies subbed or dubbed?" And they said dubbed. And I was like, me too. I love that Christian Bale voiced Howl in Howl's Moving Castle because his voice is really sexy. And that got a laugh. I know I didn't need to say all of that because there was the potential for it to be perceived as slightly weird because it's my personal taste. But the important thing that I did there was demonstrate a tiny bit of honesty and vulnerability because that resonates positively with other people. It signals to them that they can also be a little bit honest and vulnerable with me. Connecting over your interest is such an elementary principle of building new relationships. And if you are trying to do this, then you do need to be able to share a tiny bit of your mind and what you really think. But of course, we don't want to go too far too fast. And this brings me to tip number 4, which is landing the plane. In an overwhelming social situation, you might have the tendency to ramble. This could be because you're feeling nervous and you want to fill the space quickly, or because you're overly excited and getting ahead of yourself. In either case, rambling usually tends to come from a place of being overly focused on what's happening in your mind as opposed to what's happening right in front of you. And to be able to hold conversations, you need to be able to get in tune with the natural flow and progression. In other words, knowing when to not drag things out. If you're searching for where the story is supposed to go next, then chances are you've already lost it. Also, if the person you're speaking to seems to be getting shorter with their answers or looking around as if they want it out from the conversation, that could also clue you in that you're kind of losing them. If your goal is to become a good conversationalist, then you need to give the other person opportunities to speak, to spend time actively listening to what they're saying, and also to know when a good conversation should end before it becomes a bad conversation. So for you specifically, this could be thinking about the conditions of your mind while you're speaking in a conversation. Are you giving yourself enough time to think before you start speaking? And are you listening to what the other person is saying and processing that before you start formulating a response? Something I'm personally guilty of in the past, and even now, something I have to actively avoid, is trying not to think of my next response before the other person has finished speaking. There is slight drawback in that conversations can become more slow-paced or have lulls and breaks when you take this approach, but I still think it's important because what you're focusing on here is not quantity but quality of the conversation. So consider critically whether it's your own discomfort you're feeling and whether or not speaking out of your ass will fix it before you open your mouth. And that brings me to my last piece of advice, which is being proactive is attractive. Now, if you are looking to improve your talking and conversation, you do have to be willing to put in the effort and open your mouth, which obviously I know sounds really, really obvious, but I'm emphasizing it for a reason. Something that I've noticed from observing my fellow introverts is that many of us will wait moments minutes and whole conversations before speaking. And will also only speak when spoken to, but will never start the conversation. And I think both of these things are coming from a similar root cause. It's not that you don't want to talk, but you have this sort of barrier in your own mind where you've thought of something that you want to say, but you talk yourself out of saying it. And then the moment an opportunity to say it passes and you feel angry at yourself afterwards. It can be really frustrating because it feels like the words are stuck in your mind and you have this fear that they're not the right ones. But the thing is, you have to be the first one to stop judging yourself if you want that to change. For all of the previous strategies I've discussed to work, you have to be willing to actively initiate. People who go outside of their comfort zone, who take initiative and are willing to make a fool of themselves are the ones that have charisma. And if you don't want to be that person, that's okay, but you're not going to get nearly as far with the mindset that the least amount of effort is going to yield the best results. I can tell you with confidence that by the end of the kickball game, I had gotten to know 4 different people very well while I was there because of the conversations that I had. And also, I got pre-invited to the next game before I left. And the reason why I want to share all of this is because I want people to know who might be struggling with social situations and conversation that things can get better and it just requires a bit of effort and practice. Anyways, not that any of this was really groundbreaking advice, but if you did listen to the end, thank you very much. I hope that there was something helpful in there for you. And yeah, like, comment, subscribe if you feel like it. And I will see you next time. Bye.